Welcome, everyone. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. I'm Sean Casey, Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University. On behalf of my colleagues at the center, as well as our colleagues in the Office of the President who helped make this event possible, I want to welcome all of you to our conversation this evening. In a moment, President DeGioia will welcome our speaker, and it's a good thing he's doing that instead of me, because I would go on and on and on for hours, but I will spare you that indignity. But I just want to offer some brief background on the Berkley Lecture series. Begun in 2007, the Berkley Center Lecture is an annual series that brings distinguished speakers to campus for presentations on topics at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. Public intellectuals from around the globe, including Charles Taylor, Hans Joas, Jürgen Habermas, Tu Wei Ming, Martha Nussbaum, and Madeleine Albright, have delivered the Berkley Center Lecture over the past decade, discussing issues ranging from theoretical and philosophical questions at the intersection of religion and society to the very practical implications of religion in global politics and policy. Today, we look forward to Father Brian Hare being added to this list of distinguished scholars and thinkers who've offered the Berkley Center Lecture. And now I'll invite President DeGioia to introduce Father Hare and the subject of today's lecture. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and thank you for your exceptional leadership of our Berkley Center. It's a pleasure to be with all of you as we gather for the 2019 Berkley Center Lecture. And again, I'd like to thank Sean and all of his colleagues in our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs for their leadership in organizing our convening. I'd like to take a special moment to express a word of welcome to Congressman Francis Rooney, who prior to his service in the House of Representatives, Congressman Rooney served as United States Ambassador to the Holy See from 2005 to 2008. And it's great, we're grateful that you could join us for this dialogue. Today's lecture offers us an opportunity to engage the expertise of an extraordinary scholar of ethics, international relations, and the role of the church. And there's perhaps no one better to speak to this topic than our guest today, Father Brian Hare, as he offers us his reflections and insights on Vatican diplomacy across 3 pontificates, each representing pivotal moments in the past century, and the significance of this moment, and how we might best understand Vatican approaches to diplomacy today. Father Hare has demonstrated throughout his life and in his scholarship a deep commitment to being, in his words, at the intersection of the Church's teaching role and its social ministry in the public arena of American society, close quote. Father Hare has always worked at this intersection of the church and its work in healthcare and education and in the social ministry. He currently serves on the faculty at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life. He's a diocesan priest of Boston, currently the Cabinet Secretary for Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. He was ordained a priest in 1966. He worked for many years with the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, and many of you would remember that he was the lead author of the 1983 pastoral letter on nuclear weapons entitled The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise, and Our Response. He was a member of our faculty here at Georgetown for many years. He held the Joseph P. Kennedy Chair in Christian Ethics at our Kennedy Institute of Ethics, was a research professor at our School of Foreign Service. In full disclosure, I was a student of Father Hare's. He served on my dissertation committee, and I am forever grateful for every minute that I ever had the opportunity to spend with him. Also grateful for his service on our university's board of directors, 2 different tours, and also as a member of the Board of Advisors for the School of Foreign Service. In addition to his current role at Harvard as part of the Kennedy School. He also has served on the faculty of the Harvard Divinity School, where he was also the dean from 1998 until 2001. My recollection, Brian, is he didn't actually have that title, but there's a long story to that, and I won't. But he was also president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA from 2001 to 2003 before returning to Boston. He was a 1984 MacArthur Fellow, one of the earliest of the MacArthur Fellows, and has, I think, in many of our lives, emerged to provide a talk, perhaps like the one today, where he enabled us to see with a depth and a clarity a set of challenges that we were trying to make sense of in our own lives, and he provided a clarity and a coherence that previously was unavailable to us. So I'd like to again express our gratitude to Father Brian Hare, a wonderful friend and colleague. It's a privilege to have him back to present the 2019 Berkley Center Lecture. Father Brian Hare.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. First, let me express thanks for the invitation to give the Berkley Lecture. Thanks first to President DeGioia for his, as always, generous introduction. Secondly, thanks to Sean Casey, the director of the Berkley Center, and thanks to the university as a whole. Now, I would have been happy to have Sean go on for hours and hours about me until he read the list of the previous lecturers. So I hear this list of previous lecturers. I look out, I've got John O'Malley, I've got Jerry Fogarty, I've got David Hollenbach, and I'm going to dive into 3 pontificates in 45 minutes. And I've got the fear of God in me, I'll tell you. That's exactly the status that I have. So I will get on quickly to what I'm going to do. Returning to Georgetown's always a privilege and a pleasure. And so once again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. My topic, Vatican diplomacy, has a long history. The classical names begin with Pope Gelasius in 496, move on through 2 Gregories, who died in 603, and then 1085, move on to the post-Westphalian Order of International Relations, and up through the 20th century papacy. Now, you will all be glad that I will not try to summarize that. My objective is more modest in scope. So it is to provide an analytical snapshot, and I stress snapshot, of 3 papacies: Pius XII from 1939 to 1958, John Paul II from 1978 to 2005, and Pope Francis since 2013. Even with that reduction in scope, I need to acknowledge that the history of Vatican diplomacy is not constricted to the papacy, and there would be other candidates that could be analyzed through the eyes of their papacies. But to get to what I will propose to do, I want to begin with a couple of preliminary substantive remarks and then move directly on to the 3 popes, looking at their background, the international system that they encountered, and then the character of their diplomacy. First, preliminary remarks. Vatican diplomacy and diplomacy in general. The question here is, can the Vatican's role in policy be studied within the framework of contemporary understandings of the theory of world politics and the analysis of foreign policy of states? Jack Snyder of Columbia, in his book Religion and International Relations Theory, grapples with this question. But he begins this grappling with the observation that, and I quote, "The main canonical works of international relations theory hardly mention religion." The fit, it seems to me, and to him, is difficult to make. But I wouldn't give up on trying to make the fit. My sense is that there is an analogical relationship between Vatican diplomacy and secular diplomacy. We all remember analogy means two things that are somewhat the same and yet totally different. And that's the way I would describe this relationship. If you look at major schools like realism and liberalism, they are not easily translatable into analysis of Vatican foreign policy. But there's always been a realist streak in the Catholic teaching on international relations, illustrated always by the premises of the just war doctrine, for example. And if one looks at the purposes of liberal statecraft, the emphasis on values in international relations and on transnationality as the character of world politics, along with sovereign states, all of that leads me to say that there can be useful overlap in the study of Vatican diplomacy and what we get in international relations schools of thought. Second substantive question. The topic here might be what might be called what moves history. The question is, what is really the moving force in large historical questions? In the 19th century and continuing into the beginning of the 20th century, the dominant force was what might be called the great person theory of history. That is to say, history is made up of grand figures who introduced major policies and shaped the world. As the 20th century proceeded in social science, the emphasis shifted away from the great person theory to the argument that broad secular historical forces were the driving force in history. However one stands on that large debate, it does seem to me that if you're studying Vatican diplomacy, you have to give pretty large space to the great person theory just because of the nature of Vatican foreign policy. Finally, the focus of my remarks is focusing on what might be called the foreign policy of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, and the Holy See. But each of the popes I examine had significant engagement, obviously, internally in the life of the Church. Pius XII, the author of major encyclicals on ecclesiology, biblical studies, and liturgy. John Paul II, the basic theme of his papacy was the interpretation of Vatican II, meaning that he sought to provide an authoritative interpretation and a critique of other interpretation. And Pope Francis has introduced a host of internal changes in pastoral care and the administrative structure of the Church that continues on in his papacy. Now, their internal policies, therefore, could be looked upon as their principal, in a sense, impact on the Church and the world. And to some degree, things slip from internal to external, more or less, depending on the person you're studying. So let me turn now to my three models. I don't use model in the terms that the economists use it, hard data, structured, clear-cut lines. Model in this kind of thing is more general. I would argue these are three voices addressing Vatican diplomacy in each of their pontificates. And I'd summarize it this way. With Pius XII, you get the Pope as lawyer and diplomat. With John Paul II, you get the Pope as philosopher and statesman. And with Francis, you get the Pope as pastor and prophet. Here I'm trying to examine the relationship of personality and holder of an office, and the style of the papacy in each case. So let me turn first to Pius XII, the Pope as lawyer and diplomat. In terms of background, he was a member of an ancient Roman family, sometimes called the black aristocracy, to which they belonged, those Catholics that stayed faithful to the Pope at the time of the Risorgimento. They were deeply connected to the papacy over 2 generations and served as lawyers for the papacy. They were a deeply traditional and pious family, and Pacelli himself had a strong sense of being a member of that Roman family tradition. When he was ordained a priest and he signed his name It was Eugenio Pacelli Roman, and Roman meant classical Rome and religious Rome. His movement from childhood into the priestly ministry was not exactly pursued by ordinary steps. The path to the papacy, of course, can never be predicted entirely. But Pacelli's life, when you look at it, had a flavor of destiny about it. Thinking of his path from the priesthood to the papacy, I was reminded of Henry Kissinger's comment about Lord Salisbury, the 19th century British diplomat. Kissinger said of Salisbury, Salisbury's rise in politics was as effortless as it was foreordained. Now, getting to the papacy has other things involved, like the Holy Spirit, but it didn't necessarily take place in Salisbury's effortless rise in politics. So, again, it's an analogy, not an identity. His path to ordination and then to early assignment was hardly ordinary. He studied law and then decided to enter the seminary, but because of poor health, he was allowed to live at home. His first and only pastoral assignment was 2 years in his home parish, and he had been mentored from early on by Cardinal Gasperi. And so Pius XII entered the diplomatic service of the papacy, and the rest was history. No more pastoral assignments, no more deviation from a path that moved rapidly through multiple assignments. One could summarize those assignments or stages of his career in 3 steps. From 1917 to 29, he was nuncio in Bavaria and Germany. From 1930 to 39, he was Secretary of State to Pius XI, and from 1939 to 1958, he was in the chair of Peter as Pope of the Church. Now, if you look at those 3 assignments, they also bear upon his conduct of policy. In the interwar period, Pacelli was in Germany. I think it could be said, without strong criticism, that in principle he opposed the 3 dominant ideologies of the decade: fascism, Nazism, and communism. But from the beginning and throughout his career, he saw communism as the principal threat to the church. Beyond that inclination, Pacelli was also shaped by Gasperi's influence, who did not like confrontation with states. He always sought accommodation within limits. And Pius XII took that approach. That brought him in conflict with Pius XI, who was inclined to conflict on more than one occasion. So the tradition about Pius XI was that during the 1930s, when in France there was the integrist movement, which became so severe in its conservatism of politics and theology, that a cardinal's hat was removed in the midst of it. And it came to pass that one rector of a seminary in Rome from the Holy Ghost Fathers was also involved in the integrist movement. And so Pius XII called the head of the Holy Ghost Fathers in to talk about this. And the man was an elderly man with a long beard. Pius XII said, "Fire the rector." The Holy Ghost Superior said, "Your Holiness, I'll do the best I can." To which Pius XI grabbed him by the beard and said, "I didn't ask you to do the best you could. Fire the rector." So if you had an accommodationist approach, you might enter into some conflict with Pius XI. Pius XII, upon taking the office of the papacy, then began his career in 1939 as the Pope. Now, anybody who talks about Pius XII in this period of time has a huge challenge facing. And that, of course, is the question of Pius XII's policy and attitude toward anti-Semitism and toward the Holocaust. Father John Langan wrote a really fine piece on Pius XII's social teaching some years ago and began the article by saying anybody who looks at this question must have to do the following things: search through mounds of archival data, Secondly, define the position from which you're coming to judge. And thirdly, overcome the sense of secrecy that surrounds the whole affair. Whereupon John said, I'm not prepared to do that, and went on to write a great article. I'm not prepared to do it either, and so you will just have to excuse me, at least until we have the reception, when I will speak without it. So let me turn, from not doing that to the actual posture of Pius XII during the war. He followed the example of Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914 to 1922. Both of them maintained a posture of what was called impartiality, or sometimes neutrality, in conflicts between states, when Catholics were on both sides of the conflict. The rationale in both cases, Benedict and Pius, was a pastoral one, care for the Catholics involved. It was always open to vigorous critique, and that critique was intensified in World War II, far more than in World War I. As John Langan makes the point, it became increasingly difficult to sustain this traditional posture, because in World War II, you clearly had, on the one hand, genocide being carried out, and on the other hand, genocide being suffered. And so the neutrality policy, while it was followed during the war, did not escape the severe critique, and that would then eventually tie into Pius XII and the Holocaust. In the post-war order, the second stage of Pius XII's pontificate, he faced what became known in the international system as the bipolar nuclear order. The superpowers in global confrontation, armed with weapons unimagined in previous history. Moreover, what happened after World War II is the whole focus of world politics shifted from the center of Europe to the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the significance of that was that Pius XII himself was dedicated to the idea of rebuilding Europe, creating a single community in Europe with a united Germany at its center. This policy of Pius XII met severe obstacles. First, from the beginning, Pius XII advocated what he called a peace of reconciliation, not a punitive peace toward Germany and Italy. This general posture of a peace of reconciliation contained an argument against collective guilt being imposed on the German population as a whole. It also involved a strong advocacy for a program of reconstruction of a devastated Europe, particularly humanitarian rationale and deterrence of future chaos in the European theater. Pius XII and U.S. policy was a complicated mix. Pius XII opposed unconditional surrender, which was U.S. policy. He opposed the division of Germany, which became U.S. policy. He opposed a punitive peace, and yet he recognized that for other goals, like the reconstruction of Europe, then it was necessary to cooperate with the United States. The collaboration of the Vatican and the U.S. government, as I say, was not simple. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to treat the Soviet Union in the beginning as a partner in victory. Pius XII early on began to warn against this policy. The acceptance of the Yalta Agreement, and then beyond that, to the policy of containment shaped by George Kennan and ultimately followed by the United States, was a policy that ran head-on from Pius XII's position to his plan for Europe, a united Germany, a Europe across the continent. Both were being undercut by Yalta and containment. By the late 1940s and early 50s, U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union shifted into a more direct policy of opposition, and in that sense, Pius XII had advocated that position earlier. Finally, Pius XII's attitude toward the UN is interesting. After World War I, the Holy See was very critical, highly critical, and non-supportive of the League of Nations. Pius XII quickly married, in a sense, the Church to the United Nations. While he had his reservations, he, on the whole, was supportive, and that support has only grown throughout the decades since the founding of the UN. Now, Pius XII's view of communism was that it was a threefold problem. There was first that the Soviet Union was right in the middle of Europe already, right where he wanted a united Germany. Secondly, there was the role of communist parties, particularly in Germany and Italy, in the elections in the post-war period. And thirdly, there was the opposition of the Russian Orthodox Church. Faced with that, Pius XII mobilized a Catholic posture versus communism, and he engaged rather successfully American Catholics in that policy. The Bishops' Conference published statements that were in line with his approach to the problem, and there was a stream of Americans appointed to the Curia to solidify the link between Rome and Washington. At one point, there were arguments that Cardinal Spellman might become the Secretary of State, but Pius XII in the end decided to be his own Secretary of State, so that settled that question. Pius XII mobilized a Catholic position against communism. He worked with Christian democratic parties, but worked is a strange verb here. He really wanted to direct them, and neither de Gasperi nor Adenauer would have any of that. The age of the laity had arrived. And then finally, Pius XII did instruct Catholics in Eastern Europe not to cooperate with the communist regime. The difficulty with that is that those local churches were so frail, they had to cooperate to a certain degree in order to survive. So, without being complete in any sense of the term, what can one finally say about the policy? Well, it was a Eurocentric focus. It was a policy that met some degree of opposition and some differences of strategy with his immediate partners, whether the Christian Democrats or the U.S., and his instruction of non-cooperation was followed very selectively. Cardinal Wyszynski, for example, always ran his own show, up to and after Vatican II, when he met with Paul VI to talk about the Vatican Council, and he said to him, "You will understand that I understand Poland better than you do," and then he left. And so that was pretty much the background. So at the moment, I have to leave the description where it is. Let me turn to John Paul II, the Pope as philosopher and statesman. His background couldn't have been substantially more different than Pius XII's. His family was filled with tragedy. His mother died when he was young. His brother died. He was raised by his father. His life cut across 3 wars, of course. He embodied the history of the 20th century in his own life. World War I, his father was a participant. World War II, of course, he was in hiding and from the Nazis. And then the Cold War was his life of ministry up until 1989. He had an extraordinary range of abilities. He was a laborer, an actor, a poet, and an underground seminarian. Pius XII was at home. He was underground. Now, one doesn't want to make too much of that, but it's just a symbolic sense of the difference. When he began the study for the priesthood, it was as an underground seminarian in the house of the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. Early on, his academic ability was recognized, and so he pursued immediately 2 doctorate degrees, one in philosophy and the other in theology and spirituality. He was a university chaplain and formed strong views of how to cooperate with lay people. And then we come to the point in his career of the Second Vatican Council. To some degree, he was prepared for the council. As an academic, prior to the council, he was familiar with the currents of theology in Europe. As bishop and pope, he had a capacious conception of ministry, and that was always guided by the objective of trying to implement Vatican II as he understood it. But in terms of the council himself, he brought with him his experience as a priest and a bishop working under an atheistic regime, working in a profoundly Christian country. He lived in a centralized command economy, and that economy and that life existed with a vibrant intellectual culture. The culture, the economy, the regime, a complex background. The council for him was a pivotal point. He made distinctive contributions to two key texts, the Declaration of Religious Freedom and the document Gaudium et Spes, the Church in the Modern World. Immediately after the council, he implemented a large-scale program implementing the council in Krakow. The international system that he faced as a bishop and then as pope was the Cold War in full run. All agreed that the Cold War was bipolar and nuclear. He lived with that up until the time that with his cooperation, that order was eroded and essentially overthrown. He then lived with the post-Cold War order. If you look at the writings of international relations theorists and advocates, everybody agreed what was gone. It was no longer the Cold War. There wasn't unanimity about what had taken its place. And then, in addition to the post-Cold War order, of course, you had September 9/11, 2001. Transnational terrorism was overlaid over the post-Cold War order. The council, as I say, was pivotal for him. Now, why do I say that? Because I think he shaped a view of ministry, which then carried over into his diplomacy. And that view of ministry was shaped by two different contributions that he wove together in his ministry in Poland and then in the papacy. The first contribution was from Gaudium et Spes, the last and longest document of the council. As you know, that document was a rather stunning shift from what had prevailed in the church's address to modernity and the modern world from the mid-19th century, certainly up until almost the mid-20th century. I think Pius XII himself is a kind of transitional figure. He reflects the earlier period, and he began to change it at the same time. And so Gaudium et Spes was a different approach to the nature of the world. Pius XII was a person schooled in the tone and themes of Gaudium et Spes. The engagement with the world by the church, as you find it in this document, is an engagement marked by what I would call confident modesty. On the one hand, there's the sense that the church has something to say to the modern world. On the other hand, there's a real clear sense that we have much to learn from the modern world. What Pius XII took from that document, I think, in his shaping of his ministry, was a section that John Courtney Murray himself focused on, paragraphs 40 to 42 of Gaudium et Spes. What those paragraphs said were the following. First, the church has no particular political charism. It has no grace to make political decisions. Secondly, it does have a religiously based ministry which should produce the following secular results. It should contribute to the protection of the dignity of the person, to the promotion of human rights, to the provision of a sense of meaning in every area of life, and to the fostering of the unity of the human family. So a religiously based ministry should be able to produce that kind of collaboration with the world. I think John Paul II took that conception of ministry with him. If you look at what happened in Poland, it seems to me it's a religiously based ministry of resistance, but then it expresses itself in terms of the second component of John Paul II's view of ministry, and that's a human rights ministry in the church. So there he builds on Pacem in Terris, So think of the council on the one hand and parliamentaris on the other, put them together into a style of ministry that shaped his view of episcopacy, his role in Poland, and carried on into the ministry of the papacy. In a way that I can't fully explain here because of time and other reasons, but maybe because I can't fully synthesize it, John Paul II not only inherited these things, he moved them forward in his own thought. And the best example of that is the human rights question. Think of human rights this way. Pius XII did open the door to developments in Catholicism. Oftentimes he opened a door, but he didn't walk through it. That's exactly what he did on religious freedom. As John Courtney Murray said, he changed the state of the question, but he never walked through the door. He did that on more than one thing, including human rights. In the Christmas addresses, he opens the question of human rights, and when John the 23rd writes Parliamentaris, half of the footnotes in Parliamentaris are Pius XII. And so he opened the door on human rights. He opened the door carefully on democracy and the church. And both of those things, plus the religious liberty dimension, were all things that he stepped forward but didn't step across the threshold. John Paul II took the human rights teaching from Pius XII and then from Parliamentaris and pressed it forward in two UN addresses. His first address, which focused on the rights of the person as a structuring idea and measurement of society. And then the second, much less well known, and I think not well attended to, was his UN address of 1995, where he talked about the rights of nations as well as the rights of persons. And in that, he has some very interesting things to say about what I would call a legitimate nationalism and a legitimate patriotism. Things that would be very interesting to think about today when we have illegitimate nationalism and patriotism without limits. So he moved the discussion forward as well as inheriting it. But as I say, I can't really elaborate on those two. But let me turn to the character of his diplomacy. When you describe the character of his diplomacy, one begins, I think, with what I'll call the primacy of Poland. This Pope from the Second World, this Pope from the Church of Silence, now was ready to speak to the world as a whole. One of his biographers, Tad Zult, before he wrote the biography, had an article in the New Republic at the time John Paul II was elected to the papacy, and this is what he said. By electing Poland's Karol Wojtyla to the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church has thrust world politics into a wholly new dimension with extraordinary and far-reaching consequences that can be fully measured only with the passage of time. The elevation of the 58-year-old Polish prelate to the Holy See as Pope John Paul II constitutes a global event of vast proportions. The primacy of Poland. He had to address Poland first for the following reasons. First of all, because of what was happening in Poland shortly after he was named to the papacy, and that was the union movement in a new phase led by Wałęsa. Secondly, because of the danger of that moment, the difficulty of how do you confront a totalitarian state without provoking from them catastrophe. The memory of Hungary in 1956, and a bit less catastrophic, but no less serious, Czechoslovakia in 1968. So how could you carry off this religiously based resistance but not provoke a devastating response? So he had to do it because of the intrinsic significance of what was happening. He had to do it because of the danger that was there. And thirdly, he had to do it because he had been prepared for this sense of ordination. As I say, a sense of destiny. From Rome, he became the philosopher of the resistance, the advocate for Poles, and when it came down to it in the most dangerous moment, the strategist guiding what happened inside Poland. Now, the consequences of the overturning of the regime in Poland, of course, had electrifying consequences. It spread from Poland immediately across most of Eastern Europe, and then, of course, to the Soviet Union itself. Now, I'm not making a unicausal argument here, which sometimes does get made, and I think is wrong. If you had Stalin rather than Gorbachev in office, you know, the person again, not just the grand force, could have been a whole different thing. So arguments about unicausality here, Stanley Hoffman once told me there are no unicausal arguments, and so I believe him. And so I'll use it here. It didn't work that way. However, we have to listen to Gorbachev's epitaph, if you will. He said, what happened in Eastern Europe in recent years would not have been possible without the presence of this Pope. So you don't have to argue in a unicausal way to give him credit. The consequences of Poland were not simply what happened politically in Eastern Europe into communism. It also vaulted John Paul II onto the world stage even more so, even more centrally than had existed previously. It also brought into focus for international relations the question of the role of religion in world politics. Again, Jack Snyder. Now, this was only one piece of a much larger picture. The next step you take, it seems to me, is John Paul II beyond Poland and beyond the Cold War. John Paul II's comment after the collapse of the Soviet Union, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was taking a trip to Africa. And while everybody else wanted to talk to him about Poland and Eastern Europe, his comment on the plane was, the world cannot forget this place, meaning Africa, which of course was one of the dangers that when no longer was the Cold War fought across the globe, then there'd be a disengagement of states from any relationship with territory. But for John Paul II, the step was his step beyond Poland and to the Cold War. He was ready to move on to a more aggressive global papacy. It had been global previously, but it took on new dimensions. And this is reflected, I think, in two documents. The encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis in 1987, and then Centesimus Annus in 1991. If you take those two documents together, it is interesting that Solicitudo Rei Socialis is a document that gets swallowed up by history. It's the last commentary on the Cold War world by John Paul II, but it appeared so close to the actual overthrow of the Cold War that people don't pay attention to it. But he did pay attention to it. And when he wrote Centesimus Annus in 1991, which was his reflection post the Cold War, he pointed back to this. What's interesting about Solicitudo Rei Socialis is that it, in a sense, blames equally the two superpowers for the state of the world. He calls it the logic of the blocks that, he said, impeded the development of others in the international system. Then when he turns to Centesimus Annus, it isn't so much a critique of the past, but it is positioning himself among different political and economic systems and does a running commentary of what the future could be and should be. Here he tries to answer specific questions like, does the collapse of real socialism leave only capitalism as the only outcome? And he said, well, you have to distinguish the question. Tell me what kind of capitalism you mean. Limited, framed by other institutions in society, or simply let run free? If it's the first, I'm willing to say yes. If it's the second, it's decidedly not. And then he carries on in Centesimus Annus with the social tradition of the church, talking about different philosophies, the role of the state, private property, etc. He then combines that, of course, with the trips that he makes. So again, retrospectively, when you look at these three popes, one of the things one has to recognize is that Pius XII, of course, never traveled effectively, certainly outside Italy. But, I mean, travel was to the summer palace, but not anymore. You had these other two who had enormous sort of interaction between what they taught and what they did on these trips. You think of his several trips to Latin America, which produced then a dialogue about social teaching, liberation theology, etc. Produced also the historic visit to Cuba by him. You think about his relationship to Europe, where he had this sense, not so much of Pius XII's view of Europe, but he had a sense of a unified Europe. All during the Cold War, it was fascinating that there were two people who were in favor of a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, General de Gaulle and John Paul II. They together thought about Europe. Gorbachev eventually talked about a common European home, but that had different tone to it. But again, the trips in and out of Europe, and then thirdly, without ever getting into it, is the Middle East and how he dealt with it both politically and how he changed parts of Catholic posture toward the Middle East with the diplomatic recognition of Israel. Let me turn now, because I'm looking at my time. I got you. Let me turn to Francis, Pope Francis. Here, the Pope as pastor and prophet. So, an Argentinian of a family of immigrants. From the first time I was ever asked to give a talk on Pope Francis, I was paired on the panel, not on the panel, but on the program with John O'Malley. Always a risky thing to get into that. But my view then was, and I found other people have said the same thing, so I guess it wasn't original with me, but from the first talk on, I have felt there have been three basic influences that shaped Francis. First, he's a Jesuit. Secondly, he's a Latin American bishop. And thirdly, he's a post-conciliar bishop. Each one of those contributes in its own way. The Jesuit training and experience, I think, comes through again and again. When in Evangelii Gaudium, he says, rather than say, I'm going to analyze the world, he said, we ought to discern what's going on in the world. That's not a term that's used in social science very often. It's a different kind of look at analysis. I talk about him as a Latin American bishop, not just an Argentinian, because he incorporates that whole experience from Medellin on up until the end of the Cold War. And that, just as Poland shaped John Paul II, so this man is obviously shaped from where he has come from. It's not determinative, but it's influential. And he's a post-conciliar bishop, committed to stronger Episcopal conferences and collegiality. His road to ministry was not the normal road to for the papacy. He was a teacher, then a provincial, then a bishop and a cardinal, not the classical mode of the papal journey, which usually was diplomatic, except for John Paul II. But John Paul II had extensive diplomatic experience in dealing with the Polish government. So this really was out of ordinary. Indeed, I think one of the best pieces written on Francis, and I still think it is, was a piece that was written early on by actually a woman who's a colleague at Kennedy School now, Nancy Gibbs. Nancy Gibbs was editor of Time magazine. She wrote more editorials for Time magazine on the Person of the Year than anybody else in the history of Time magazine. This is what she said about Francis as they named him Person of the Year. In his 9 months in office, he has placed himself at the very center of the central conversations of our time about wealth and poverty, fairness and justice, transparency, modernity, globalization, the role of women, the nature of marriage, and the temptations of power. He captured the world by his personality and style. Now, one has to think about this in perspective. John Paul II had captured the world with a funeral unlike any funeral in the 20th century. So could the church do it twice? Could it produce different kinds of personalities that had a compelling kind of impact on the public as a whole? This man had that compelling point of impact. At the same time, I have always felt that if you stay too long on that point, you really miss the point. And so I would distinguish Francis's persona, as Gibbs describes it, and you could take other descriptions of it that would be similarly complementary. But I would distinguish between the persona of Francis and the Francis Project. For the Francis Project, I believe, is not personal. Rather, he seeks to shape a practical ecclesiology. Practical ecclesiology. This is not Karl Rahner thinking about the church. This is coming from a different angle. And what he seeks to shape is a practical ecclesiology, meaning a church capable of addressing the world, the Gaudium et Spes world, and to some degree the non-Gaudium et Spes world, because for all its strengths, Gaudium et Spes reflected the North rather than the South. And so he was interested in both. Like John Paul II, he sought to implement the council, and he also sees himself in continuity with Catholic social teaching. When he is criticized for things he says, he always says, I am quoting others, or at least reflecting others. His view of the church and the world is not as defined as Gaudium et Spes for John Paul II, but his interest is the face of the church today. His argument that the church should be a field hospital in a combat zone, a house of mercy. Francis's goal, in my view, is this: it's justice in the world and mercy in the church. And Gibbs, again, has a comment. So when she names him the person of the year, she says, for pulling the papacy out of the palace and into the streets, for committing the world's largest church to confronting its deepest needs, and for balancing judgment with mercy, Pope Francis is Time 2013 Man of the Year. His view of the church as a field, hospital, etc., could be applied inside the church to debates that we have, or I think it applies more broadly to the world. It's focused on what you might call the edges of life, the edge of the circle of life, what he calls the periphery. The goal is not to leave the rest of the church or the world behind, but to connect the edge with the center. An interesting idea. Think of our own country in terms of connecting the edge and the center, whether it's economically, politically, socially. The way he carried out his character of diplomacy was to choose 4 transnational issues to concentrate on. Now, transnationality, since the middle of the last century, has become a significant component part of world politics. It is clearly still a world of states, and it would be, I think, foolish to think not. But transnationality has surfaced in 2 ways: transnational problems and transnational actors. Transnational problems are issues that are of such a nature that no single nation, no matter how powerful, can, in a sense, resolve them for itself. Transnational actors have the following characteristics. They're based in one place, present in several places, have a trained corps of personnel, a significant communication system. That's the World Bank, that's Phillips Petroleum, that's IBM, and that's the Jesuits. So transnational actors have a comparative advantage in moving ideas and resources across the boundaries of sovereign states. So he chooses these 4 problems, which I can only identify and not solve. First, the environment. I would say that the document on the environment is his best teaching document so far, the most sophisticated, the most tightly woven. It combines normative and empirical data. It combines religious views and science. It joins the personal with the global. And it's a distinctive way in which he ties poverty and environmentalism together. The London Guardian, not necessarily a contributor to Catholic social teaching, said the following. They said of this encyclical, the most astonishing and perhaps the most ambitious papal document in the last 100 years. Francis knows on this issue he's got a unique pulpit, and he's committed to not waste it. If the overarching environment of our life is the environment, immigration is the fabric of world politics increasingly. Not the only issue, but part of the fabric. Immigration has become part of the central fabric of world politics. This Latin American bishop is at work here. As John Paul II was a person of destiny, having lived in Poland and addressing the world of his time, this son of an immigrant family, seeing the world from the global south, if you will, brings a distinctive view to this question. The third question is inequality. Immigration is an external challenge to states and to our conception of ourselves as a society. Inequality is embedded in our societies, including the advanced industrial democracy. After the financial crisis and rooted in recent past, inequality has reached levels where it is a vibrant political issue, an issue that makes it harder to deal with immigration. He tries to deal with the two of them together. His final issue is nuclear weapons. These first three issues, the environment, inequality, and immigration, are tied together by social and economic bonds. He moves into a different arena, the arena of security and diplomacy. And here one has to again think of the background. I have 3 more minutes, Sean, and I'm yours. So Pius XII essentially was classical view of war and peace in the Catholic Church. He was a supporter of the just war doctrine in principle. When he was challenged on that, his answer to it was to say no Catholic could be a pacifist. That is not said today, but it was said in his time. His address to nuclear weapons was fairly glancing. He did not enter into any of the distinct kind of discussion that a man like Paul Ramsey entered into. And so that's the first stage. John Paul II, I think, reflects Gaudium et Spes on war and peace. On the one hand, a much stronger assertion of the need for the church to be involved in peacemaking and to be hesitant about the use of force. But he does argue, as Gaudium et Spes did, that in a world which is anarchic, no center of political authority, some use of force can be necessary to preserve basic values. And Francis now has moved onto his own ground. He has moved to some degree beyond his predecessors. Now, I think to some degree you have to distinguish 2 questions: what he says about nuclear weapons and what he says about war and peace in principle. It is the question of nuclear weapons that is clearer, I think. John Paul II was critical of what he called the insane arms race and critical of the slowness of arms control agreements, but he supported them. Francis, to some degree, is not only critical of the arms race, but he wants to go after a concept that stands at the center of how states have dealt with the nuclear age, and that's deterrence. And so his critique of the arms race and his goal of 0 nuclear weapons would not be all that different from some of his predecessors. But the critique of deterrence is different. Now, there are different ways you can approach this. You can have the goal of going to 0, but not necessarily cancel out deterrence. Francis himself says he is not speaking authoritatively here, and there is room for debate. But this is the 4th issue that he has combined with the other 3. On all 4, you're at the center of today's world politics, and on all 4, Francis has something to say. The question of how he says it is for another lecture, because how he says some things provoke response, and that's partly when he speaks, I think, as a prophet with prophetic discourse. The strength of that is evident. The limitations of it is you can draw criticism that you have to be ready to answer. And so in the Q&A, I might be able to tell you more about that, but that is one piece of this. And I finished 3 minutes late. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that. I'm sure we have hours of questions, but will not be able to do that. Let me ask you one question, then we'll quickly pivot to the audience. And we'll have microphones moving around. And when we get to that point, just raise your hand, and we'll try to be generous in picking. So when we get to that point, please identify yourself and ask a question quickly. And the more we do that, the more good answers we're going to get here. I'm struck by your framing of looking at the international system for all three popes. And if there's a common thread here, each of them navigated these amazing pivots in the international system. And you asked the question sort of how do IR people interpret religion? I'm curious if you can say something about how the popes were interpreting the international system, that sort of reverse the polarity here. They seem to have had a finger on the pulse of the changing political times that enabled them to respond nimbly. And I'm wondering if you can pick any of the three, but was it about each of them, or maybe you want to focus on Francis? What is it about his ability to read the signs of the times and respond to the rise of transnationalism, for instance, in the international system?
Well, I would have to say that popes don't explain themselves usually. I mean, that's sort of part of being pope. I mean, if you take if you take Parliamentaris and think of the debate that had gone on human rights for a century before. I mean, you start with Gregory the 16th. They said, what do you think of the modern liberties? He said, they're utter nonsense. Deliramenta, he said they were. And so you have this long debate between natural law and natural rights. You find it reflected in the literature. And then all of a sudden, John the 23rd just sort of closes the issue with no footnotes that, in a sense, secular ideas of human rights can coexist with ours. Now, he knows they're not identical, but he solves it. So popes often don't get into their description of the international system. They get into threats and possibilities. But if you ask intellectually, I think there's no question that John Paul II had an articulated vision of the Pius XII had an articulated vision, but it was basically against communism, and a vision of what he hoped Europe would be. There is a book in preparation for this. I just came across a book that it only came out last year from a woman named Chamides, who's an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, I think in Milwaukee. And it's called The 20th Century Crusade, in which she traces the Catholic responses to the 20th century, post-World War, the papal responses. I mean, and she has this theory that it is built on multiplying concordats and trying to get Catholic teaching embodied in positive international law. It's a book I like, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that's in it. So they don't get into that kind of thing. They may have it, and people inside do. I mean, Casaroli could have sat in any seminar in any university in this country and clearly defended himself on all of that. But the popes don't declare those kinds of things. So do they have a conception? I think yes. Do they have an articulated conception in the language of IR theory? Probably no. But do they get to the point of an understanding from which policy then follows? I would say yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I have hours of questions myself, but I'm going to spare you that. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and why don't we go to John in the back there. And John, tell us who you are.
I'm John Borelli. Hi, Brian. Thank you very much. Very provocative, and many things you said. We could raise many questions for dialogue, but I want to go back to the first third of your lecture. Do you think Pius XII and his policies were hampered by the fact that he tried to be his own Secretary of State?
Well, I think even if he had a Secretary of State, he would not have paid a lot of attention to him. So, I mean, I think it was just easier. I mean, I think he was absolutely convinced that he wanted to control things down to the last minute. So, I mean, you know, remember Nixon and Kissinger and poor Bill Rogers over at the State Department. So Bill Rogers could have taken long lunches every day and no one would have known the difference because that wasn't where policy was being made. And so Pius XII, he had obviously two very talented assistant secretaries, Tardini and Montini. And he did use them, although one of the pieces I did in research for this said he depended on Tardini and Montini up to a point. He had dinner with them once in 10 years. And so, I mean, it wasn't exactly a working relationship. So, I mean, it is the sense that he wanted to control the policy down through, I think, was so strong that it wasn't such an extraordinary gap not having a Secretary of State. People had all kinds of complaints of how it ran and how the offices functioned and all of that, but not of substantive nature that it would have changed if he wasn't there.
Question up here.
John Hurley, I teach part-time religion and international politics at Catholic. Getting back to this area, I've recently read a book, Vatican Secret Diplomacy, which focuses to an extent on the relationship between Bishop Joseph Hurley and Pope Pius XII. I wonder, are there particular Americans that you think have played a role in influencing these three popes?
Any other Americans, are you saying, besides Hurley?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, you
like
had
let's
Mensch.
say Cardinal O'Malley now, for
Yeah,
example.
he had Mensch in Germany as his ambassador to Germany. He had Hurley in Florida, and there was a third. There were three Americans that he appointed to diplomatic posts at that time. I was never quite clear how I think Hurley maintained being Bishop of St. Augustine, Florida, and ambassador at the same time, and I was never sure how all that worked. But it was part of this idea that he wanted to engage more Americans into the diplomatic service and tie the bond. I mean, there was no question that he had doubts about Roosevelt's policy and a difference. But at a certain point, I think, he just recognized he needed the United States, primarily for Reconstruction. And in that sense, and so he was going to tie that knot as tightly as he could. That's just my sense.
Question up here.
Father John Hirsch, teaching the English department here. How can you account, or how can we account, for the extraordinary reaction that Pope Francis has occasioned, this extraordinary anti-Francis reaction that's come about both internationally and also in the United States, the country of John Courtly Murray?
Well, I think it's a multi-dimensional question. Some of them, some legitimate and some not legitimate, I think. So, I mean, I think part of the reaction is people don't like what they hear and feel that they just simply don't want to. They want to be quite selective about how you pay attention to the Vatican. Now, remember, we've had this before. I mean, that is to say, we argued a long time around Vatican II that not every statement out of a pope's mouth was not only not infallible, it might be authoritative but non-infallible, therefore open to critique. So there's always room for that kind of thing, and in resisting what I think are sort of illegitimate arguments, we don't want to go back to a period where every time a pope coughed, everybody was to agree. That's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be, but the argument, some of this argument is not so much a reasoned opposition to Francis. It is just opposition without reason, And increasingly, it's opposition without reason and with a lot of money behind it. And so that is clearly not a healthy kind of thing. It is one thing to agree or disagree with the Pope. It's another thing to run a movement that is self-interested, funded by money, and is kind of an attempt at a kind of takeover, if I put it in extreme terms. Now, I think sometimes Francis says things in a way that is prophetic discourse, and the prophets are never known for syllogistic arguments. They do not want a reasoned argument. They want conversion, and tomorrow, preferably. So when you get into highly complicated questions and you use the prophetic discourse, there's a place for it, but it's not everything. And I think so I mean, I just gathered a range of critiques on that basis. I mean, George Will, who, makes an argument when he wants to make an argument. The President of the United States is finding that out now. But, I mean, he can eviscerate you in 750 words. His comment on Francis, he's only written one column on Francis. He's written several on John Paul II, very commendatory. But he's written one column on Francis. It was just before the Pope's visit. And he said, the Pope comes to the United States embodying sanctity. That was the way he started. He said he also has flowing behind him sanctimoniousness. And then he argued that several of his positions are demonstrably wrong and will hurt the people he says he represents. Now, you can argue with that or not, but that's a different kind of thing. One of my colleagues at Harvard, Bob Stevens, S-T-E-V-I-N-S, Bob Stevens is an acknowledged expert on environment and climate. He wrote a column in which he was complimentary to the Pope for taking this issue on. When the Pope gets to the question of carbon tax, for example, and says this is not a way to go, etc., Stevens says he's got the data against him. He said he's working against the best knowledge in the field. Well, you might argue about that, but Stevens is going to bring an argument to bear. And then if you talk about going to zero nuclear weapons, again, as a goal. But the question is how and how you get there. And so at least you have to deal with Tom Schelling's question, not to Francis, but to his friends, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn. Schelling said to them, who has told us the world is going to be safer with no nuclear weapons than with a few nuclear weapons? Now, behind that's a whole argument about enforcement power, et cetera, but it's an argument. You can't shake Schelling off. So those kinds of things are legitimate, necessary, and I'm not saying the Pope shouldn't use prophetic discourse. I do say somebody else has got to be around to talk about it, or otherwise you can easily get discredited with sweeping statements. Now, some of his statements are just highly vivid statements, and that's different than a factual mistake, but it does, I think that's part of where the opposition comes from, and that's different than the first thing.
Really have a question in the third row, then we'll come to Jose next.
Hi, Father. I'm Paige Plucker. I'm an undergraduate. I'm going to ask you an impossible question.
You're going to ask me about?
An impossible question. Given the kind of trajectory of the papacy over the past century, what would you say the next pope is going to be like? if you can even get
Well, as I mentioned in my speech, the path to the papacy is not easily determined. My guess is this, totally. I mean, this is like throwing a dart at that board up there. I mean, so you first got a non-Italian, then you got a non-European. There's bound to be discussion about two things. Where is the demographic future of Catholicism? And that's in the Southern Hemisphere. Where is the greatest concentration of that? And that's in Africa. And so my guess is these things are never determined unicausally, but my guess is that an African pope would not surprise me at all. Now, he may be selected on totally different reasons, not demography, not regionalism. It might be we need to, as you know, you have a papacy for 25 years or 20 years with Pius XII. We want a transitional pope. They got one. It was called John the 23rd, upended the church in a positive way. But my guess is an African pope would certainly not surprise me, and I think would have a lot to support it.
Let's come to Jose. Wait for them. We got a microphone. Yeah, here it comes.
One of the paradoxes of our transnational moment is, of course, the kind of coalitions that one finds, the attempt to develop a transnational moral majority between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Putin regime, American evangelicals, the Catholic right, certainly in Europe, against what they call is the liberalism, secularism, and gender ideology of the European Union, and of course linked to populist parties which are nativist, anti-immigrant, and xenophobic anti-Islam. And one could say that had it not been for this Pope Francis, we will have today the Catholic Church much more involved in this coalition. So how do you, one of the fundamental things he introduced, you said he has, each Pope is not only a diplomat, but also brings something internally to the Church. And what Pope Francis brought is a kind of moratorium on the moral confessionalism that had made gender the key confessional identity of the Catholic Church and its policies.
I'm going to ask some help. I have hearing aids, and in this kind of room, I'm missing a good deal of that. Tell me what the question was.
Well, not quite to the question.
Well, the question is, had it not been for this Pope, the change in the centrality of questions of gender within the Church, that today we will have a different church with different coalitions, probably with American evangelicals and the Russian Orthodox Church being linked in Europe against, with populist parties against the European Union.
Okay. This is
So the question is Francis has been a mitigating effect to prevent the Catholic Church from aligning with populist movements globally. And I'm just curious.
Sorry.
Is that's a fair summary?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think, as I mentioned in the speech, one of the things that I was fascinated by as I thought about John Paul II is he's a perfect person to talk about a legitimate nationalism, a legitimate patriotism over against the other side, because it seems to me that these are ideas, particularly patriotism, we always thought as a virtue, so virtus stat in medio, there is too much and too little, but nationalism can be the same thing. So, my sense is there's some wisdom there. I think, secondly, I guess what I wanted to say, but it was very telegraphed, was that if you take immigration and inequality, in between those you get this witch's brew sometimes of people feeling that inequality levels have affected them in such a way that they're then resistant to any immigration at all, even though that might have nothing to do with it whatsoever. So I do think that there is a way in which I would take the environment, immigration, and inequality arguments and in a more expanded way, think about the relationship among those three. Each one of them has its own inner logic, but looking at the relationship. Now, question about building a coalition against that is, it's partly a church task and it's partly a secular task. You've got to, if the inequality argument is what it seems to be in this country, I think, that there are sectors of the country that feel that they have no understanding why their real wages haven't increased over the last 20 years. That's an honest-to-God problem that is a public policy problem. It can get mixed up with other things, but it needs to be answered on its own ground. I apologize, I just didn't get it all.
No, this is well, can I don't see any hands in the moment. Okay, all right, I will not intercede. Please, we do have a hand here.
Good evening, Father. My name is Daniel. I'm a graduate student in the Security Studies program. I had a question specifically about Pope Francis and his goal to address those 4 transnational issues that you brought up. I was wondering that as the international system does go through this shift, and as our current administration and potentially in the future, if the U.S. withdraws from an international community where a lot of the norms of the Catholic Church have perhaps been institutionalized, and that's a form of power in and of itself, I was wondering what you consider Pope Francis's strongest leverage of power is to use to address these really difficult transnational issues.
Well, I mean, I think his fact of choosing them, they're not the only issues he could have chosen, but the fact of choosing them is wise. Every one of those is real, is addressable, if you will, and you have to build coalitions on any one to address. I think, interesting enough, Francis has handled the President of the United States very well. He just doesn't take the bait. He just doesn't take the bait. I think he thinks there's no real possibility of making progress with this president, and therefore he's not going to talk a lot about that. I think he did it with one sweeping statement, and that is, we ought not to be building walls, we ought to be building bridges. That's enough. That's enough. Because to get into a shooting match with President Trump is just not worth the time and effort. The payoff is almost non-existent, and the quality of the debate would, quite honestly, if you did take the bait, would lower the prestige of the papacy. So I think he just realizes there are limited possibilities here. He can spend his time with Angela Merkel, or now the Europeans have their own problems, but the fact is there's more room there than there is right now at the United States. So I'm not trying to tell you how to vote. I'm just trying to tell you that I think this Pope is smart enough not to get into that kind of catfight with no outcome that is useful.
We have a question in the back.
You talk about the importance of human rights for John Paul II, and I would just like you to talk a little bit about the pushback on liberation theology that happened.
Well, 2 seats over, or one man in front of you can discourse on this forever. So there are a lot of people around here. I'm not talking about secularization with the man in the front row here. So I'm ducking these things. But I mean, obviously, it seems to me the story was an evolving story. So he went to Puebla. He went to Puebla before he went to Poland. Now, Puebla was set ahead of time, but he went. In a sense, he could have ducked that and to get his feet on the ground, but he went. And it seemed to me the strategy he used in Puebla was he felt there were things he needed to criticize, but he also felt he had to have an independent policy about social justice, which he stressed in a major kind of way, his own version. That started the discussion. Now, obviously, it was seen as a criticism of liberation theology, but there was positive content to that speech, both doctrinally and in terms of human rights and social justice. The next step of the 2 letters of the 80s, the first one being quite critical. The second, it seemed to me, always what the second letter from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith did, in my view, was to incorporate large sectors of liberation theology into the ongoing social teaching of the Church. So it wasn't so much a liberation theology issue, it was where liberation theology has been and how it relates to the larger social teaching. Then you had the Brazilian bishops who came to him and said, you know, let us tell you about how this fits in our setting. And he then wrote the Brazilian bishops a letter and said, you know, I understand what you're saying. Now, of course, when you get to this papacy, all of that, to some degree, is history, because nobody less than Cardinal Mueller, who hasn't been all that positive at times about the Pope, has said the Pope is influenced by liberation theology, and Mueller thought that was a good thing. It was part of the pastoral life of the Church. So I think with John Paul II, It was an evolving story. I think that chapter is not the definitive chapter on this. This chapter might not be either, but eventually schools of thought coexist with other aspects of Catholic teaching.
So we have time for one more question, so let's go to Mary Ann here.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Thank you. Nuclear arms control and disarmament treaties are falling apart as we speak. The guardrails are really off on the nuclear arms race, and Pope Francis is going to Japan to make a major statement on nuclear weapons. How do you see, what ways could he be effective in trying to stop the development of a new arms race or draw greater attention to this issue? What do you think are his openings at a time when the U.S. and Russia seem to be going in a different direction?
Well, I think we're at a dangerous moment. We're at a really dangerous moment. And therefore, that's why my approach to these things is you have to take steps and you have to concentrate on different steps at different times. You can have an ultimate goal. That's sort of, I think we used to call that the final cause, the last in execution, the first in intention. But in between, you got to have efficient causes that get things done. And so I think the visit to Japan, he will take advantage of that. I thought John Paul II's visit to Japan was remarkable. He had this wonderful phrase. He said, to remember the past is to commit oneself to the future. To commit oneself to the future is to commit yourself to choices that can see the past never happens again. So the present situation we're in, remember from the U.S. side, that the launching of $1 trillion proposal for the whole redoing of the nuclear arsenal, that story started under Obama. There was an original commitment under Obama that Trump has now either simply gone forward with or I think expanded. Secondly, a part that I didn't get into the talk, when you start talking about the shape of the international system today, obviously one of the things that I think, we talked about transnationality. Transnationality's there. It's going to be there. You can talk about multipolarity. There's multipolarity today in the international system. But we now have what Walter Russell Mead called the return of great power politics. You've got a rising China and a resurgent Russia. And so we haven't thought about that kind of thing for a long time. We got happily out of the custom of thinking that the world was simply bipolar and nuclear. We now have a situation where all of the other things that have been there in the post-Cold War, an increasing multipolarity, increasing role for transnationality, arguments about multiple rising powers, but it now looks like we're headed into a tripolar kind of relationship at the top of this. And the dangerous part, as you know, Marianne, is that the fabric of even the fragile arms control treaties that we have are being unraveled. So the INF is gone. There's no talk about renewing New START. And that puts even more pressure on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, to my mind, is absolutely necessary, but always was morally flawed. It was a morally flawed treaty from the beginning, had to be, because the idea of the treaty was, we don't want any more. Well, that's okay if you're the one saying that and you possess them, but it doesn't work for most of the world that have signed up to this treaty. So things are unraveling here. My guess is that we're going to have to concentrate on how we take the view of the international system that has developed over the last, roughly the last 30 to 40 years. That's not going to go away, but over it we have to put this cupola of this rising big power treaty. And the question there is, to some degree, to go back to those bilateral, now trilateral negotiations, because you can't get all of this done. As important as the UN is, you can't get it done in that framework. People just don't aren't willing to put their cards on the table. So there are things to be done there on non-proliferation. But in my view, we're going to have to think about big power politics along with a more fluid, multipolar system that is there.
We have run out of time. This has been a remarkable speech and fascinating discussion, which we can continue into the reception area. Please join me in thanking Brian for this.